the narrative now becomes OpenAI is trying to be a hyperscaler. And I would say in the way that Meta is a hyperscaler, like the way we've talked about, right? For their own workloads. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of The Circuit. I am Ben Bajarin.
Hello, world. I'm Jay Goldberg.
All right. Not a week goes by, Jay, that something interesting does not happen. And we had this week quite the announcement between OpenAI and AMD, which I should say, honestly, shouldn't have totally taken people by surprise, since Sam Altman was at AMD's day on stage with Lisa Su at their Advancing AI Day, talking about that they would be collaborating on future product or something along those lines, if memory serves. And so it felt at the time like, hey, they seem like they probably will be a customer, and the stock did nothing after that event. However, this week, with the announcement that OpenAI and AMD are doing a deal, which I'll let you unpack, the stock went somewhat astronomical, waking up in the morning to what was at some point a 35% jump in the day and came down, which just shows you people believe this is some validation for AMD's Helios racks, because I obviously believe that's the that's the product they'll use. But it also brought a bunch of discussion, potentially concerns. The cyclical financing, circular financing people came out in hordes. This is nutty. I saw the NVIDIA fraudsters out in full force, which, in case everybody is, I'm calling them NVIDIA fraudsters because if you believe NVIDIA is a fraud, you probably can't pronounce it to begin with anyway. Anyway, all of that to say, it was a enjoyable week of semis. So let you unpack the deal. There's a couple things I saw I want to talk about on it, but just give us the landscape of the structure of this relationship.
Okay, at the heart of the deal, AMD is now going to be selling their a lot of MI series GPUs to OpenAI. OpenAI is now going to become probably going to be a big customer of theirs. And in exchange, AMD is giving OpenAI up to 10% of AMD stock, right? So they're giving them options to buy a whole bunch of AMD stock, and it's very complicated. We haven't seen many of the details. We haven't seen the documents about the deal yet. We got some clues. They had a conference. AMD had a conference call about this, but now AMD is going to be installing up to 6 gigawatts of GPU systems, which is a lot. Or excuse me, OpenAI is going to install 6 gigawatts of AMD compute. And so you said we shouldn't have been surprised. A lot of people were surprised. A lot of people, myself included. We were all surprised. We knew that OpenAI was an AMD partner, and that OpenAI was looking at this stuff, but nobody knew how OpenAI was going to afford it.
Right.
And now we still don't exactly know. Apparently, they're going to pay. They're
Right.
going to pay for it with vested AMD stock, is the assumption. But
Right.
no, that's probably not exactly how it's going to play out. But still, 6 gigawatts of compute is a lot, right? You think about we're building the first gigawatt data centers right now, and those are immense. So 6 of those. The week before, I don't know, it feels like 5 years before everything's happening. The week before, NVIDIA and OpenAI had a deal, and OpenAI is going to install 10 gigawatts of NVIDIA. So that's 16 gigawatts of compute OpenAI plans to bring online over the next 5-ish years. So a great deal. Well, a big validation for AMD.
Right.
This is going to be starting later next year with their MI 450 series, and then progress through the future, presumably into 500 and whatever comes after that. We've been having this debate here on the street. How serious is AMD a player in AI compute for GPUs? And they are now, right? I had been operating on the assumption that it would take a couple more cycles for them to really get traction here, and they've brought that forward, right? This is like I actually had a lot of I've had a lot of pushback. People I know a lot of people on the street who said that AMD was never going to go anywhere in GPUs. There are a lot of those conversations going around prior to this week, and those
No.
are all erased, right? I think I thought it was going to take them longer, 27, 28, to really get going, but they're a real player sooner than
Yeah.
anyone expected.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a couple things. I think in general, just for our audience, I remain intrigued by this idea of instead of sort of thinking about what's the word I'm looking for, um, like I don't know, GPU sales or something along those numbers of actually looking at this in terms of what it costs or what the revenue content or dollar content is for silicon relative to gigawatts. Obviously NVIDIA has been saying that. I think this is an interesting metric, right? Just look at total gigawatt, look at total compute. And now you have NVIDIA and to some degree AMD starting to talk about, right, what their share will be. So we know the numbers that, Jensen has used, X number, right, of dollar. I think it was 30 to 40 billion per gigawatt. AMD is kind of out there guiding to like something around single digit revenue gigawatt,
Single digit billion.
etc.
Yeah.
Say again? Yes. Yes. Single digit billion. Or sorry, significant double digit billions, which
Yeah.
essentially has been what Lisa has sort of guided to. And even when we talked about this on a couple of calls, people were saying, look, do you think you could be in the double digit billions, let's just say 20 billion in 2027, 2028, something like that. So there's the look slicing this relative to dollars per gigawatt of compute, which I do think is a reasonable way to look at it, which is why, as we talked about last week, chasing gigawatts is interesting. How much do we have? Who has it? And let's understand what that translates in turn to compute dollars. When again we remain constrained in a lot of these. So that I think is at least a helpful framework. Nobody's modeling, just for everyone, nobody's modeling the same share of dollars per gigawatt for AMD that they're giving to NVIDIA. And I think that's fine. The other thing I think is worth pointing out is this is not cannibalization. This is expansion because obviously if NVIDIA had, I don't know, right, 4 million more GPUs, OpenAI would buy those as well, whatever share allocation they would get. There's a compute shortage and it makes sense for OpenAI to do this. Now, what I think is interesting, which has now entered the conversation this week, again, per our conversation last week, is the narrative now becomes OpenAI is trying to be a hyperscaler. And I would say in the way that Meta is a hyperscaler, like the way we've talked about, right, for their own workloads. I think this is the direction that they're going. And I think this is the commentary that NVIDIA and Jensen in particular is putting out around, we funded them because we want to see them become a hyperscaler. I'm essentially, adding words to what I think the dance around of this narrative is, which I think makes sense. We could debate this, but I noted, I tweeted this week. I don't know if you saw it, but like a couple of the folks on the street updated their CoWoS models for TSMC, which included a significant amount to OpenAI for their own custom ASICs, like more than Meta. Now they could be wrong, right? These are supply chain checks, but regardless, it sounds like a lot OpenAI securing a lot of capacity for their own silicon. So I think the framework is there that maybe they think we're going to be our own hyperscaler again, the way that Meta is. But I think that's an interesting addition to this narrative, right? Can they pull that off? Should we think of them as orienting themselves as a hyperscaler? What does that mean, right, for the landscape? But I do think, just looking at this from OpenAI standpoint, there's some credibility to the idea that they are trying to scale in that level of ambition.
So I agree. OpenAI and Sam Altman have no shortage of ambition. My My big question, though, is how is OpenAI going to afford all this, right? Because if you look at, so let's just use 50 billion for every gigawatt. That was Jensen's number for compute, right? Just for compute is 50 billion for every gigawatt. Maybe it's probably going to be less than that, like 40 for
Yeah,
AMD, but
right.
let's just
Yeah,
make the
right.
math simple. Let's do 50. And then you assume on top of that, there's another, 10 billion of other equipment that they have to buy, the the power and the cooling and the, I don't know,
Right.
storage, whatever.
Yep.
So um, just for so it's a what is it? It's a $300 billion implied value for the AMD deal. It's 500 billion for the NVIDIA deal. There's an Oracle deal they did with CoreWeave that's 100 billion. Now there's probably some overlap there, but we're at least at $800 billion just of compute, and you factor in everything else. We're at the point where OpenAI is talking about $1 trillion in capex over the next 5 years. Or we don't exactly know how many years, but sort of 5 to 10 years, call it. I mean that's like that's a lot of money,
Yep. I know.
right?
So I get this, and this is where, I mean, I guess I'm curious, right, from your perspective, from the finance standpoint. Like, we have two things that are true. We have one, this is the most expensive build out we've seen in history, while simultaneously being the most demand centric. Like, there's no shortage of demand. So it's sort of like people feel like if I could just come up with, like, I have to do this. This is a YOLO moment. You only live once, right? Moment, a generational opportunity, but nobody has the free cash flow for this. So they have to figure this out. Like, it's an unprecedented moment of build out. We know compute is going in this direction. I mean, I've been reading these a ridiculous amount of data center build reports, right? So there's like 52 in total, right? Data centers sort of out there today. There's roughly 3 gigawatts of expansion that's projected to happen per year. This is coming from people within the data center building environment. But you literally, like, that's it. Like, this is not coming from anywhere else. So essentially, like we talked about last week, like we're constrained in the ability to build these things, to fill them out, etc., while simultaneously knowing that we have enough demand for all of these things, right? Should that all exist. So the capital intensity is like unprecedented. Nobody has this amount of free cash flow. So it really comes back to, like, where, like, how do they get the money, right? It's not a question of, well, we're going to do this, but it's not warranted. Like, it's warranted, but we don't have the free cash flow. And that's what I'm not sure. I don't know how they
So
work this out.
so I'm gonna disagree a little bit here because and this is where we start to get into the question of how circular all of this is. I agree today. If you opened up a data center with a gigawatt of compute, you could fill it, theoretically, you could fill it with demand. But that demand who's that demand actually coming from? It's coming from one of six, maybe seven companies.
Yes. Right.
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 So it's Google, Microsoft, Amazon, Meta,
OpenAI.
OpenAI, Oracle, and X.AI. I think we have to.
Sure.
They're
Yes.
coming out here.
Correct.
So that's
Right.
seven
Right.
companies. Right. Now, two of those, OpenAI and X.AI, have pretty questionable cash flow. Right. They're startups.
Yeah.
The other five have recurring businesses that make them a lot of money, but again, to your point, not that quite that scale.
Yep.
What are they all doing with it? Right. That's, I think, sure, there's a lot of demand right now to run models, to build these big foundational models, but then what, right? And I know I'm repeating myself, but like, there's no clear cut consumer use case. Enterprise adoption is good, but it's nowhere near the scale to get to pay this back, right? And so I think the demand is all coming from those seven companies to run their models, to build their models.
Yeah. For
and
training.
and
Yeah.
right, we're doing a lot of training right now, and of course there's the assumption that we're going to do a lot of inference, but inference is still sort
You
of,
don't need gigawatt data centers for inference. You can do that on 400 to 600 milliwatt data centers, which are small, and that's perfectly fine.
well,
So
that's a fairly bearish comment. I would argue that if we can find some really fantastic use cases for this, that we're going to need all that inference. And I assume that when people build these models that are going behind these deals, I'm assuming they actually build models, that they're factoring in like at some point this transitions to inference heavily. So I think that the demand case is still the big question here. Right. If we want to talk about breaking beyond sort of these 7 customers, who are the end customers, it's still the Super 7, the super intelligent 7. I don't know. We need a new
Right.
name for them.
You're right. You're right. No, yeah. That's a good idea.
The sentient,
I
the
would like
sentient
this.
7, because we're all going for AGI apparently.
I think you nailed it. That's a good one.
All right.
People hit us up on the socials if you like the
Yeah.
sentient 7. But that's it.
Sentient 7.
So the all right. Back to the data center. One of my theses, which I think you exactly sort of hit on, though, is that I actually think you will see fragmentation in data centers that might be a little bit more specific purpose. So maybe you're neo cloud and you're building out an inference data center because again, you're not going to get 2 gigawatts of compute, right? So it makes sense to have, I think, some segmentation, and I also think you're going to see segmentation in silicon, right? You're going to see inference specific ASICs or GPUs instead of general purpose ones. You're going to see training ones, which NVIDIA does, right? You might see hybrids of that, right? So I do think you'll see, right now we're in sort of this, everything's roughly general purpose. And I think you're going to see far more specialization happen. And the implications of that, how long that takes, I think are interesting. But to your point, the like we still don't see, and you're exactly right, enterprise adoption of this. And remember, last year, I think we talked about you could chime in on this too. Like, what does this mean? But we talked about it sounded like at the end of 2025, we were going to start to see more scale deployments of AI via dozens of CIO and CTO surveys we've seen. That has now shifted into middle to next year, even toward end of next year, with the caveat that one I just read yesterday from Morgan Stanley is the vast majority of those they're saying are going to the cloud. Right? There was originally a theory that like, hey, you'll bring some of these, you'll repatriate AI workloads on prem. That per this particular survey, only 4% of CIOs said they were going to bring those back on prem. So this is still a largely all this stuff's going to run in the cloud for their own workflows, their company's workflows, and that's feels like a 2026 story now because their pilots are done. They're working with vendors like Microsoft, Salesforce, right, et cetera, to integrate. So that part is elongated, but that's coming back to our question of what we're always saying, like how do you charge for these things? You know, is this what's the seat per employee that you're going to pay, and then what does that scale look like as your cloud bill goes up with your service provider or whoever you're using to implement these models. So essentially, right, you're paying more to that cloud provider now to do AI than you weren't. And that's, but I don't know what that number is per employee, for example.
Yeah. So so with that in mind, I have recast the way that I think about this OpenAI AMD deal. Right. I th- right. The knock on the deal is that it was circular financing, and to me, circular financing. I've been asked this a million times. What is circular financing? To me, circular financing is when you pay a customer to create demand, right? And that's not what's taking place. To your point, there's people this demand. There's demand for this from the small number of customers, but there is demand. They're not creating demand. What aim right? So it's not really circular financing. It's kind of ovalish. It's warped circle. It's not a circle. It's a little more complicated than that. What is happening though is AMD is paying for market share. They're paying for market entry, right? They just
Right.
gave up 10% of their company to win this business, and for a lot of people that sits uncomfortably because typically it's startups who do that, right? AMD's 50-year-old company, well established company, but it's perfectly common for startups to give up equity in order to win business in a new market, right? And the first example that comes to mind is Qualcomm, right? Qualcomm gave equity stakes to Sprint and Verizon, or their predecessor companies, in order to get CDMA off the ground.
Mm.
Right, and I think that's how we look at this here. It was like AMD is not a startup, but they are a startup in this brand new AI market,
Right.
right? And so
Right.
in that sense, it is actually reasonable for them to give up equity in order to secure a major validating customer. And I think that's important. And so we're fighting for share here. And like if you just sort of step back, like AMD is a supplier and OpenAI is a customer, and AMD is trying to sell a product and they're giving a big discount to OpenAI in really good financing terms to OpenAI in order to buy their product. That's not that unusual. It's just that it's their, rather than knock 10% off the price, they're giving up equity to do it. It's a
Yeah.
little funky, but I think that's justified. And I've been struggling with this demand question. Why are the sentient seven going so hard after this, even when the end use is still kind of
Right.
sort of
Right.
unclear? And I think it's. I used to think that it was just like, oh, it's fear. They're just it's YOLO, it's FOMO, right? They don't want to miss out, right? YOLO FOMO. We got all the acronyms here. But I think instead what's happening is there is a massive shift in share that could take place in the next few years around cloud compute, both public and
Right.
private hyperscale cloud, right? And you the all of seven of them have to participate in this arms race because they don't want to miss out. Right? And
Yeah.
we're already seeing this play out, right? Oracle is now a serious player in cloud compute in a way that a year ago they were sort of an afterthought when you talked about it was the big three. Now Oracle's a serious cloud service provider.
Yeah.
Google seems to be gaining a fair amount of share as well, right? Google
Yeah.
again was like
Yeah.
a distant third and always kind of questionable, and now they're not. So we're already seeing these shifts take place, and then the other big part of that is the neo clouds, right? All the hyperscalers who are all the large data center operators who aren't those four, they're a meaningful share of AI compute now too. I haven't actually seen numbers about it. I should probably go try to calculate it up, but like they're a meaningful share of AI cloud service compute. Obviously much smaller than Amazon or Azure, but still like the market for cloud computing was for a decade three companies, and now it's dozens. And looming behind all of that is NVIDIA. Like, what does NVIDIA really envision for the neoclouds? They want them to be a counterweight to the negotiating power that Amazon and Azure had for years. And I think I think the sort of strategic framework that we have to look at this as. There is a little bit of belief and faith, but this is not just about a race to AGI. This is a race for market share in what's a pretty important market for cloud computing.
Yeah. I agree. And that's why I think it's not unreasonable to start to think about, OpenAI as a hyperscaler more in terms of where they might start to verticalize to capture more of those dollars versus right now, which is right just an API, right? Sort of token call, which I think again, not a bad business model, but to we talked about, right? There might be grander ambition here about where you capture dollars in the, in the AI, this particular inference scale out environment. So
Well, I think, I mean, this is the big unknown in this market. Well, there's two big unknowns. One is what's going to happen. What is NVIDIA's software ambitions? We don't know that, but the other big unknown is what is OpenAI really trying to do here, and I'm not entirely convinced they know. But they are certainly in terms of scale, unquestionably a hyperscaler. To your point, right? That's where they are one of these seven massive data center operators.
yeah,
Their business model is still super unclear, right?
yeah,
They have a lot of subscribers. I think they're $15 billion ARR right now, something like that.
yeah,
So they're 20 maybe. They're growing nicely, but again, nowhere near the scale needed to afford all the stuff they're buying.
correct, absolutely,
Ben Thompson was out this week saying that they're trying to be Windows, right? They're trying to be this
Right.
operating system for this AI world,
Right.
which I take his point. Mechanically, it'll be different than Windows, but I take his point. But and at the same time, they're clearly gearing up to do advertising, right? Advertising and e-commerce,
Yeah.
right? They had a developer day this week too, where they talked about all the ways you can plug in Shopify and different e-commerce platforms and sort of do one-click AI purchase, right? That's clearly the next step is sort of to move into that area. I'm not sure that's big enough, right? Because what they're really doing there is they're talking about being a substitution for Google, and Google is pretty good and has all these established partnerships already, and they have pretty decent, more than decent. They have very credible AI stack and more compute than any of these guys. So just on the surface of it, from what we've seen so far of OpenAI's business model, they're gearing up to compete with Google, and even that I'm not sure is big enough to really justify $1 trillion of capex over the next 10 years, right? So I have to we need something new is what I'm coming to. We need something new that is only possible with AI compute. Because if you're just talking about like being the other search engine, then that's just a battle to the death between Google and OpenAI, and I don't think that's quite sufficient.
Yeah. Agree. Agree. All right. Let's switch topics to, again, everyone's favorite company to talk about, which is Intel, because news happened this week post an event that was in Arizona last week where I was getting a tour of Fab 52, which we want to talk about, but also seeing more details around Panther Lake and Clearwater Forest. There's a lot of interesting stuff around this. So I'll start with Fab 52, which essentially like they took us to tour where 18A is being produced. I've toured a lot of fabs through the years that we've done this. This was probably the most sophisticated I've ever seen in automation. The scale was very, 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 very big. And more importantly, the capacity that I think Intel has is pretty significant, which was sort of a question I had going into this. Like, one, you got to produce stuff for yourself. Two, you want to produce for customers. This cannot be a fab that looks like it's only making making wafers for one customer, and it's not what it looked like. But the state we're at now, and granted, it's been a couple years since I've toured a scale production fab. The automation that's happening now is pretty wild. Like, there's very few humans in the loop, which to me is insane. Like, really, there's just people kind of monitoring things, but it's very automated, and a lot of it just kind of produces wafers itself. Really, like, it's a factory. Um, but I think, again, more importantly, I think Intel did this to say, look, 18A is here, 18A is ramping, will ramp into next year, and we've got the facility and the foundry to do this. More importantly, in the United States, and the mantra that they wanted to really hit the nail on the head was, this is now the most sophisticated process, leading edge process in the United States being made by Intel. I think that was let's get this point across. We are now manufacturing, on US soil by a US company, the most sophisticated process technology that there is in the United States. I think some people would like to argue in the world because of backside power and power via, which TSMC doesn't have, but let's just, for the sake of argument, say it's definitely true in the United States. I also feel like, personally, it's one of those things where, like, when you see the sophistication, the level of technology that goes into making the miracles that is semiconductors, it's like the US can't lose this as a US company. Like, you further that conviction, because anybody who's a technologist looks at that and is like, this is astounding. And more just fuel for my personal fire of like this needs to be something that U.S. companies do here because it is incredible innovation to manufacture at scale. But anyway, all that to say, I think they made the point, right? We're manufacturing this now on US soil. We're back in the competitive process node game. I'm not going to say they're beating TSMC as a whole, but let's just say it's certainly competitive. The product stuff to me was much more interesting. But if you have a comment, go ahead.
I think I was watching it from afar, and I get your point. It's an incredible factory. It automated. It has all the latest technology. But did they ever once mention Foundry? Did they talk at all about 14A? Right. There are these big looming questions around Intel's future that I looked at this and I was like, this is incredible. They're gonna make all kinds of incredible products here. But is this sort of like the end of it? Right.
Right.
And like, is this the world's best battleship that built in 1945, right? And then nobody
Yeah.
needs battleships
Yeah.
anymore. I was worried about that. Like I was really curious. There are obviously big questions behind all of this stuff, and I don't think they talked about that side of it at all. I think they tried to
No.
avoid talking about
Couldn't.
it. They couldn't,
Yes.
right? And
Correct.
like part of me thinks I'm hopeful as an American citizen. I'm hopeful that they're just not talking about it because it's under negotiation and it's complicated, and they're going to announce something someday soon.
Right.
But there's a that's great, but there's a clock. There's this beautiful fab is
Absolutely.
built. There's a clock. There's a timer built running on top of it.
Yeah. I will say it was interesting though. There were a lot of Intel customers, execs that I know at customers who I saw there, and I was like, "What are you guys doing here? This is like this is a like you guys know the roadmap." And they're like, "We're literally just here to see the fab. We just came for the fab tour." Like people were just showing up for the fab tours. And while I think we all agree we don't love the idea that the government continues to subsidize Intel, to be honest with you, if I mean, it would be interesting if Trump or others came, but like Intel should just invite every stakeholder in U.S. government to see that because I think they would have that same feeling like this is unbelievable that you actually making something like this in this state of the art facility that's just a technological marvel in size and scale, by a U.S. company in the United States. So just to again further how critical I think this is. But to your point about like where does this go, I know that just industry chatter had been everything on 18A looks good on paper, but we want to see how it looks as a product because the
Mm-hmm.
showcase customer for 18A is going to be Intel. And it seemed like people were saying if Intel product is very good on this process, it increases the chances that people consider Intel Foundry again for silicon customers. And I would say we don't, right, we need to see the reviews of these things. However, what Intel is saying about these products looks very, very good. And I'll say there's two things. One, anybody who's followed Intel for a long time knows one of the failures of their client portfolio had been that they did not have first and foremost performance per watt really at all. I would say Lunar Lake got better, but Lunar Lake performance per watt varied. We tested machines that got 10 hours. We tested machines that got 22 hours. Okay, I get that OEMs implement these things differently, but the reality is like there was a lot of variance in that, but it got closer. But the failure of Lunar Lake was that it only fit a couple of portfolios. So like an OEM says, hey, I want everything from $700 to let's say $1,500. And Intel did not have that in their portfolio. In fact, they haven't had this for some time, a architecture that scales. This is the first time in a long time that they actually have an architecture that scales from clear entry level all the way up to performance and pro machines. And obviously, they completely rethought the way that they design this, also in I think, one of the more sophisticated client chiplet designs that scales all the way from right an 8 core to a higher core 16 core and variances in between. So kudos to them for doing that because that was a huge issue. They also redesigned the cores. And I will say this in terms of what I know about the way that Apple does these things, and I think Intel took a huge strategy from Apple's playbook, which is every generation. So first of all, Apple has always had an architecture that is scaled. Like for the longest time, they've had it from phone, in fact, watch to studios, right? Just an incredible architecture that scales. However, Apple has always come down and said, made every generation essentially made P cores more efficient while maintaining performance and E cores more performant while maintaining efficiency. Intel looks to have done this with their new core designs. The P cores are very efficient, but also performant. The E cores are performant, which means the E cores can run the variety of your normal system tasks at a good performance, but are also much more efficient. So I like what I've seen. Now I'm going to make an analogy. People may love or hate, but I was at AMD's event when they launched the Zen architecture, which to me was the pivotal moment of their turnaround. And there were things within that architecture that were very clear, good designs, meeting the market, well executed architecture. I'm not saying that, this is a gigantic pool grab, right, in terms of upside, which was like AMD's coming from a non-existent challenger to, but this to me feels very much like a Zen moment for Intel, and that this is a very good architectural approach, and this is the kind of thing they can build on from here on out. Right? This isn't something that just needs to be changed next year with Nova Lake. This is a very, very good foundation. I think will compete, and I think it will compete across the stack from entry level all the way up to performance systems, and that's without right whatever happens with NVIDIA in the future, lumping that GPU onto what sounds like a good architecture. So that's Panther Lake. Architecturally, yes. Go ahead.
Okay, I mean that makes sense. So we have Intel out with some very good products. They're competitive again in client and potentially in server, although those products are not coming out for another few months, right? 18A is a good process for Intel, right? And I think right, and I think that's consistent with what we've been saying is 18A exists so that Intel can survive. It's a little bit more than treading water. They can survive. They come out. They show that they can actually design product again. They have a process that's is not better than TSMC necessarily, but competitive enough.
Yes, competitive enough. Right.
Right. So all of that is encouraging.
Yeah. And all right. So that was Panther Lake. Yes, agree. I also obviously, the OEMs I know are very happy about this because Intel's obviously strong in their portfolio. Intel remains dominant in the enterprise, and really they've just wanted Intel to have a good product that with good performance per watt that scans their portfolio. That's really like they've just been begging for this, and so now they have it. So I hope that helps. Now on the data center side, this one's interesting to me because there was a critique of the conversation that happened when we were there because the IPC gains on Clearwater Forest, even though it's 288 cores, were not like significant. Now, however, it got far more efficient. And the other part that I like about Clearwater Forest is I actually think that is probably the showcase design for Intel Foundry and advanced packaging, because it is the most disaggregated design, I think, in the industry, but certainly that Intel has ever done. When you see some of the things that I tweeted about that in particular, but just the way that they've architected this from EMIB to all of the different integrations of backside power, Foveros, right, to 3D stacking, like everything they talked about for years, right, that Gelsinger talked about, like, look at what we're doing in advanced packaging, look how great EMIB is, and we're doing Foveros with 3D and yada, yada, yada. Like, this is the first, like, showcase of all of that. And it is it's architecturally very complex across all those things, what they did with cores and then what they did with just the advanced packaging for this tile. So I'm intrigued by where that goes. But my point about the cloud, right, this is designed to be, right, general purpose cloud native workflows. And I don't think that's an area, despite, right, the critique they've got, that just needs significantly more performance yet where it's at. I do think you do this when you need AI agents to scale and whatnot. But right now, for a cloud native product, it needs to be more efficient. Like, efficiency is the benchmark to keep proving on, not necessarily performance. And you'll see that from everybody, right, who's making said chips in the next 12 to 18 months. But overall, I think, again, right, they took some of the same architectural cores, the P cores and the E cores that they had done with Panther Lake, that extends to Clearwater Forest. And again, on paper, it looks very, very good. But again, broadly, I appreciated the design complexity, and that was sort of like just the showcase of all they've talked about in process and packaging, in particularly that chip.
So I look at this and I say this is the sort of the roadmap ahead for how Intel comes back. Right? They have their packaging, they have their process. I'll take your word that this is a good architecture and design. You make a compelling case, but this is how they come back, right? Through all these things.
Product comes
right.
back. Yes.
Product comes back, right? And right, yeah. Because the packaging element is really important here. It is encouraging to me that they have moved to chiplets because they have this great packaging process. Why not make use of it? Right? Chiplets is the way. Seems like a really easy step for them. It's an advantage they have, especially when the world is CoWoS constrained. So I think that's the appeal. And if they can prove that 18A is good, and then 18AP, is it?
P,
which is for customers, and they can at least get some trials done on that. They're not going to get any significant business on that, but at least prove that they can provide customers with the tools, the PDKs,
right,
so that customers can kick the tires a little bit more extensively than they have been. Then there is interest for 14A and Intel as a foundry. Okay, clock's ticking, but this is how they come back. This is how they come back.
Yeah,
if they come back.
Agreed. And I think, again, right, the point, this difference between 18A and 18P, I think, is important, right, because it was very clear that this architecture is designed to maintain a level of performance that's expected, but be more efficient, and that's 18A. The next one, I think, can now do those two things: actually get more performant while also being more proficient. This is essentially what theoretically should happen on paper with products that are on 18AP, which again sets itself up well, right? If you're a third-party customer and you're like, well, do I want efficiency or do I want performance, or a mix of both, which is what TSMC has sort of always offered you. You could pick a variety of those things. You could double down on efficiency or performance, or a middle ground. This Intel is set up for that, theoretically. So anyway, all that to say, it's a very, very good step forward, right? This is not a leap, but I think Intel is essentially, you could consider them competitive again on all the vectors they need to be competitive on, both in process and product. And next year will be very telling in terms of people get their hands on these machines, people start benchmarking, we see OEM response, we look at quarterly revenues in terms of their ability to scale and ramp this. But anyway, from what I saw, I like what I see. And now let's see this stuff move to market and see what happens.
Okay. I would really like to see them succeed. They need to go to 14A though, right? Because if they don't go to 14A, then they lose a lot of this stuff.
They lose a lot, yeah.
Right. And so I really, really would like to see them move forward. I hope they have a customer out there in the works that can get them a foundry business. I'm okay if it wrecks their margins for another 5 years, so long as they have a path forward. I think that matters, right? Otherwise, this is like if this is it, and they don't get that customer, and they abandon 14A,
Right,
then this is like,
right.
you know, the who was it, the Scout Raiders in the last cavalry charge of the United States Army in 1942.
Yep.
Impressive, but completely behind the times.
Yeah. Yes. Agree. All right. Well, anyway, we've more on Intel as usual as things transpire. All right. Last topic. Qualcomm made an acquisition this week, which I don't know. Some people shrugged their shoulders and whatnot, but they purchased Arduino, and this falls under kind of, I would just say, like their broader ambitions to develop the industrial IoT and IoT under the Dragonwing brand, which if anybody's not familiar, Dragonwing is sort of their IoT brand. And I hope everybody's familiar with Arduino, but that's what tinkerers and builders used to experiment and make a host of IoT things, maybe even low level robotics. But anyway, that was an acquisition that happened. So we wanted to talk about what did you take away from this acquisition?
I'm a big fan of Arduino, and I know that they have been sort of groping for a place in the world. It's a very cool product. My kids have a lot of sets. They're not for me. They're for my kids. I haven't bought
Yep.
10 Arduino kits and just messed around with them. That's for my kids, I swear. No, it's a good product for IoT, for tinkerers. Uh, it needed a home. It's not entirely a fit with Qualcomm's line of products, but like it's close enough, and I hope they do good things with it because it is interesting. And people aren't going to care in terms of numbers. I don't think they disclosed the purchase price, which means it's pretty small. It's not material to numbers really, but it shows that Qualcomm is thinking more broadly about how to play in the world of IoT and the software tools that we don't really have in IoT and ways that we could do this. So I think this could be a nice little. It could be a good home for Arduino. Uh, you know, Qualcomm gives them a little bit of rain, a little bit of money, and lets them sort of build out and deploy this more broadly. You could get some really good products out of this. IoT doesn't
Well, and
have
that
IoT doesn't have software today, or it has too many
right.
softwares, and a little bit of a big player like Qualcomm coming in and saying, "Hey, we're going to put our weight behind this one," could
Right.
drive things.
And to a degree that they foster this, and people who are building the next generation of things or tinkerers are doing so on a Qualcomm foundation. Again, fits their ambitions of connectivity everywhere, the role they want to play in IoT and industrial IoT, and kind of making sure that they're the center of that, because it is a growth story they've talked about, and I think we all agree that all things become connected, and that requires little chips and sensors and whatnot. So good for Qualcomm to compete and want to be the center of that. So um, good to watch. Good to watch. All right, everybody. Thanks for listening, and we will talk to you next week.
Thank you, everybody. Tell your friends.